There's a specific type of family fracture that television almost never gets right. Not the explosive kind. Not the screaming matches or the slammed doors or the dramatic ultimatum delivered at the worst possible moment. Those are easy to write. Those are satisfying in a theatrical way that lets audiences process them cleanly and move on. What's genuinely hard to portray, what takes real craft and real nerve, is the slow, quiet kind of breaking. The kind where two people who love each other are standing in the same room and somehow, inexplicably, cannot reach each other. Where the distance between them isn't made of anger or cruelty, but of something more elemental and more painful. The simple fact that one of them is changing and the other doesn't know how to exist in the new shape of that change. That is what The Pitt Season 2 is doing with Mel and Becca. And I think it's one of the most psychologically honest things the show has ever attempted. So let's actually go there. Because this storyline deserves more than a surface read, and I think if you've been watching closely, you've already felt it. That low-frequency hum of something important happening underneath every scene they share. Let's name what that is. To understand the breakdown, you have to understand Mel. Not Mel as she presents herself. Competent, controlled, emotionally available in the particular way that people who have spent years managing a household and a child with complex needs learn to be. But Mel as she actually is underneath that presentation. Because there's always a person underneath the role, and in Season 2, the show starts pulling at that distinction in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable to watch. Mel is a caretaker. That's not an insult, and it's not a reduction. It's a psychological orientation that shapes everything about how she moves through the world. She reads situations. She anticipates needs. She adjusts herself, her plans, her emotional bandwidth in response to what the people around her require. For years, this has been not just functional, but necessary. Raising Becca, navigating all the specific textures and demands that come with parenting a neurodivergent child, has required Mel to develop a kind of hyper-attunement that goes beyond ordinary parental love. She doesn't just love Becca. She has organized herself around Becca in a way that runs so deep it's indistinguishable from identity. And that's the thing about caretaker identity that the show is quietly but precisely interrogating. It works beautifully until the person being cared for stops needing to be cared for in the same way. Until they grow. Until they assert the independence that the care was always theoretically in service of. And then the caretaker, who has built a self around the act of giving, suddenly finds that the architecture of who there has no foundation anymore. Because the foundation was never really theirs to begin with. Here's the thing about Becca that I think is essential to understand before anything else. She is not rebelling. I want to be really precise about this because the show could have taken the easy road and written her as a teenager in opposition, pushing back against a controlling parent in the way that TV has trained us to recognize and categorize. That's not what's happening. What's happening is something more specific, more interesting, and honestly more heartbreaking. Becca is becoming. She's not fighting Mel so much as she's discovering that she has her own interior life that exists separately from Mel's perception of her. And for any young person, that discovery is exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. But for a neurodivergent young woman who has grown up having her needs interpreted, her experiences filtered through someone else's understanding of what those experiences mean, that discovery carries an additional weight. It's not just I'm my own person. It's I've always been my own person, and I'm only now learning what that means. Season 2 gives Becca moments of real self-possession that the show frames carefully, not as triumphs over Mel, but as genuinely neutral expressions of who Becca is. The way she communicates, the things she prioritizes, the boundaries she's starting to understand she's allowed to have. None of this is positioned as performance or provocation. It's just Becca, more fully herself than we've seen her before. And the tragedy is that Mel, who loves her daughter with a ferocity that is completely real and completely unquestionable, keeps reading Becca's emergence as a referendum on their relationship, as proof of distance, as loss. And that misreading, that gap between what Becca is actually doing and what Mel perceives her as doing, is the engine of the whole breakdown. Let's talk about codependency for a minute, because I think the show is doing something very careful with this concept, and I want to give it its due. Codependency gets thrown around a lot in popular culture, and it's usually deployed as an accusation. This idea that a relationship is broken because one party is too attached, too involved, too enmeshed with the other. The word has a judgment baked into it that makes it easy to hear as a diagnosis of pathology. But what The Pitt is doing is something more compassionate and more accurate than that. It's showing us how codependency forms, not as weakness or failure, but as adaptation. Mel didn't organize herself around Becca because she had poor boundaries or an underdeveloped sense of self. She did it because Becca needed her to, because there was, for years, genuine and legitimate necessity in the depth of Mel's attunement. The interdependence they developed wasn't dysfunction, it was function. It was what the situation required. The problem is that functional adaptations don't automatically dissolve when the situation changes. The architecture stays even when the necessity that built it has shifted, and now Mel is walking around in a self that was constructed to manage something that no longer needs to be managed in the same way, trying to figure out what she is when she's not actively needed. And the answer she keeps arriving at, in quiet moments of panic that the show renders mostly in silences and half-finished sentences, is something close to nothing, which is devastating, and which is also not her fault. The show is smart enough not to blame Mel for this. It's also smart enough not to let her off the hook for the specific ways her grief over losing her caretaker role is landing on Becca as pressure, because both things can be true simultaneously. Mel's pain is legitimate, and her response to that pain is creating harm. That's how real dysfunction works. It's not villain and victim. It's two people in a painful situation making understandable choices that are nevertheless costing them something. I want to spend some time here because I think this is the most under-discussed dimension of the Mel-Becca storyline, and it's doing some of the heaviest psychological lifting in the whole arc. The show's treatment of Becca's neurodivergence in Season 2 is doing something genuinely progressive, not in the sense of making grand statements about it, but in the quieter and more significant sense of simply treating it as a context rather than a condition. Becca isn't defined by it. She isn't limited by it, but it shapes the specific texture of the distance between her and Mel in ways that go largely unnamed within the story itself. Here's the theory I keep coming back to. For most of Becca's life, Mel has been the primary interpreter of Becca's experience. Not because she imposed that role, but because Becca needed someone to help translate between her interior world and the external demands of navigating environments and relationships that weren't designed with her in mind. Mel became fluent in Becca. She learned to read the signals, anticipate the overwhelm, buffer the situations that were too much, and amplify the ones that were too little. She was, in a very real sense, Becca's interface with the world. And now Becca is developing her own interface. She's finding words for her own experience, building her own frameworks for understanding herself, requiring less and less of the interpretation that Mel has been providing. This is growth. This is exactly what good caretaking is supposed to produce. But from inside Mel's experience, it feels like being made redundant. Like the expertise she's spent years developing has been quietly declared unnecessary. Like Becca has decided she no longer needs the very thing that Mel built her sense of purpose around providing. What makes this particularly painful, and what the show handles with real subtlety, is that Mel can't quite name this loss without it sounding like she's begrudging Becca her development. So she doesn't name it. She carries it, and the weight of the unspoken thing keeps reshaping her interactions with Becca in ways that Becca can feel but can't always locate the source of. That gap, that mutual inability to name the actual thing, is where the real damage happens. Not in the moments of conflict, but in the accumulated weight of all the conversations they're not quite having. There's a question running underneath every scene Mel is in during Season 2, and the show never quite surfaces in dialogue because surfacing it would diminish it. The question is, who am I when I'm not needed? And it's a question that the show refuses to answer quickly or cleanly, because the honest answer is that Mel doesn't know yet. And not knowing, being suspended in that uncertainty without any clear path toward resolution, is the specific kind of psychological suffering that television usually fast-tracks past in service of plot momentum. The Pit doesn't fast-track past it. It sits in it. It lets Mel move through scenes carrying this unanswered question like a weight she can't set down, shaping every interaction she has, coloring every moment that should be straightforward but somehow isn't. There's a particular quality to her in Season 2, a slightly off-center quality, like someone who's been given new glasses and the prescription isn't quite right, that the performance renders beautifully without underlining. And the thing about Identity Crisis is that it tends to express itself sideways. Mel isn't walking around saying, "I've lost my sense of self." She's expressing it through control, through hovering, through the specific micromanagement of Becca's decisions that looks to Becca like distrust, and that is at root something much more desperate than distrust. It's Mel reaching for the one thing that still makes her feel like herself, being necessary, being the person who knows what Becca needs before Becca says it, holding onto the role because she doesn't yet have anything to replace it with. This is the real breakdown, not between Mel and Becca specifically, but within Mel. And the family fracture is the external expression of an internal collapse that Mel hasn't fully consciously registered yet, which is why it can't be resolved through conversation alone. You can't talk your way out of an identity crisis. You have to live your way through it. What Season 2 does with painful precision is show us how two people who love each other can end up profoundly isolated from each other in the same space. Mel and Becca aren't estranged in any conventional sense. They share space, they share meals, they move through each other's lives. But there's a growing translucency between them, a quality of seeing each other without quite making contact, that the show renders as one of its most quietly devastating dynamics. Becca's isolation comes from the specific experience of being seen as a version of yourself that you've already moved past. When you're neurodivergent, and someone who loves you has a fixed understanding of what you need and how you experience the world, an understanding that's now slightly out of date, their love can start to feel like a container that's too small. It's not that the love is wrong. It's that it's calibrated to a past self, and the experience of being known but not quite accurately is its own kind of loneliness. Becca can't fully relax into Mel's understanding of her because that understanding keeps missing slightly. And she can't fully explain why without it sounding like an accusation. So she gets quiet in a particular way. Not closed, just slightly unavailable. And Mel reads that unavailability as rejection. Meanwhile, Mel's isolation is the loneliness of someone watching a beloved person move further away and feeling utterly helpless to close the distance while simultaneously, and this is the critical part, doing things that increase it. Because the way Mel reaches for Becca is the way that used to work applied to a situation where it no longer does. She's using old tools on a new problem, and each attempt that fails lands as fresh evidence that she's losing her daughter, which generates more desperation, which produces more of the behavior that's creating the distance. It's a loop, a genuinely painful, genuinely realistic loop that the show traces without offering easy exits. And watching it unfold in real time is the kind of viewing experience that makes you want to stop the episode and sit with it for a minute. Because it's too real. Because you've either been in that loop or loved someone who has. Here's the frame I find most useful for understanding what's happening between Mel and Becca, and I want to offer it as a theory rather than a conclusion, because I think the show itself is still working it out. What Mel is experiencing, at the center of everything, is grief. Anticipatory grief, specifically. The grief of someone losing something that hasn't entirely left yet, but that she can feel slipping away. The grief of watching a child become an adult. The grief of a purpose completing itself. And grief, when it can't name itself, tends to transform. It turns into anxiety, into control, into the particular restlessness of someone who keeps trying to fix the unfixable. Mel isn't trying to hold Becca back consciously. She's trying to manage the unmanageable feeling of loving someone who is, appropriately and healthfully, needing less of you. She's trying to outrun the moment when the role that organized her sense of self is officially complete. And the tragedy is that her grief, in its unprocessed form, is actually accelerating the very thing she's afraid of. Her desperation is pushing Becca faster toward the distance she's terrified of. The show, I think, is going to have to eventually give Mel a moment where she recognizes this, where she sees clearly that the breakdown isn't about Becca at all, that Becca is fine, that Becca is actually doing beautifully, and that the crisis is hers alone to navigate. That realization, when it comes, has the potential to be one of the most emotionally resonant moments of the season, because it's the moment where love becomes truly selfless, where Mel stops trying to be needed and starts trying to understand, where she grieves what's passing and opens toward what comes next. Whether the show gets there cleanly, whether it gives Mel and Becca the space to find a new language for what they are to each other now, that's the narrative question I'm watching season 2 to answer, that I keep thinking about who this storyline is actually for. Because it's not for teenagers figuring themselves out. The show doesn't position Becca's experience as the primary lens. And it's not purely for parents navigating the specific territory of raising neurodivergent children, though it speaks to that experience with unusual honesty. What this storyline is for, I think, is anyone who has ever had to figure out who they are when the role that organized their sense of self is no longer needed in the same way. That's an enormous category of human experience. It's not just parents. It's anyone who has ever defined themselves by what they do for another person. Romantic partners, siblings, friends, children caring for aging parents, and then found themselves standing in the wreckage of that definition when the situation changes. The specific texture of Mel's crisis is parental, but the underlying experience is universal. And the show is making the argument quietly and without fanfare that the transition through that kind of identity dissolution is one of the most psychologically demanding things a person can go through, that it deserves compassion from others and from oneself. The Pitt is doing something brave with Mel and Becca. It's refusing to resolve their fracture quickly or neatly. It's insisting on the reality that some of the most important breaks in a family happen slowly, quietly, without clear villains or obvious fixes. And it's trusting its audience to stay in the discomfort of that, to not need a tidy resolution in order to recognize the truth of what they're watching. That trust, that belief that viewers can sit with unresolved pain and find meaning in it anyway, is what makes this storyline premium television. Not the plot mechanics, not even the performances, though those are extraordinary. The belief that the real story is always the one happening underneath the surface. Always. And that the audience, if you give them the chance, will go there with you. Mel and Becca are going to find each other again. Or they're going to find new versions of each other, which might be harder and better simultaneously. But the journey toward that is where all the meaning lives. And season 2 is making sure we feel every step of it. End card, engagement prompt. The Mel and Becca dynamic is one of those storylines that hits differently depending on where you are in your own life. Drop in the comments. Are you seeing this from Mel's side, Becca's, or both? Because I think where you land says something real about where you've been. And I want to hear it.